Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor, and I'll be presenting on the case David Wojnarowicz versus the American Family Association. I'll begin by introducing David Wojnarowicz for anyone who may not be familiar with him. He was a professional multimedia artist and gay rights activist whose work centered on queer identity and AIDS awareness during the Reagan administration, which was largely unsympathetic to addressing this disease that was disproportionately impacting the LGBTQ+ community. Wojnarowicz was working in a context in which AIDS was the leading cause of death among young adults in the United States, surpassing heart disease and homicide. Many people within his close circle, and ultimately even Wojnarowicz himself, contracted the disease and died. Through his art, he hoped that greater exposure to queer imagery would help garner attention for AIDS advocacy and governmental action. The American Family Association, then, was an anti-LGBTQ+ Christian fundamentalist group led by Reverend Donald E. Wildman. Wildman created a pamphlet titled, "Your Tax Dollars Help Pay for These Works of Art," with the phrase "works of art" written in quotes, that contained sexually explicit images cropped from Wojnarowicz's art in an effort to halt funding for his work through the National Endowment for the Arts. Although the images from Wojnarowicz's artworks that were appropriated within the AFA pamphlet were created with the artist's personal funds and resources, these pieces were included in the Illinois State University's 1990 Tongues of Flame exhibition and its corresponding catalog, both of which were funded by the NEA. Viewed in isolation and away from the full pieces they were a part of, these cropped images in the pamphlet could reasonably be misconstrued as primarily obscene and pornographic and therefore not meet the conditions for NEA funding. The headline of this 1990 article in the New York Times reads, "The man from Tupelo, Mississippi," referring to Wildman, "may not know much about art, but he knows what he doesn't like." Given the way that the pamphlet misconstrued his work, Wojnarowicz sued the AFA and Wildman for copyright infringement and defamation. Under the New York Artist Authorship Rights Act, artists are protected from attribution to works that have been altered without their permission. Further, Philip Yenawine, an expert on contemporary art who was employed by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, testified that these flattened representations of Wojnarowicz's art could dissuade art institutions from exhibiting his work due to his perceived association with pornography, and therefore impact his ability to make a living because he relied primarily on his art. But according to the court, the effect on the market for or value of the copyrighted work is the single most important element of fair use. And Wojnarowicz was not able to prove any negative financial consequences that resulted from the pamphlet, only the potential for such consequences. So ultimately, the court deemed the pamphlet libelous per se, and under the New York Artist Authorship Rights Act, awarded Wojnarowicz $1 in damages and dismissed his claim for copyright infringement and defamation. Here's the check that was made out to Wojnarowicz. So this case ultimately became a matter of free speech because publicly funded works must be open to critique and commentary. Still, the court's decision did not take into consideration the fact that Wojnarowicz used his own finances to create his art, and it was merely one exhibition and catalog that were funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, and also that the AFA deceptively distorted Wojnarowicz's art, and also that they created the pamphlet as part of a fundraising campaign against the NEA, in which they raised $5.2 million in a single year. These circumstances all create presumptions against fair use that would otherwise be granted for purposes of critique and commentary. Ultimately, I would argue against the New York District Court's ruling because the court had relied on economic and utilitarian impacts to determine whether or not Wojnarowicz was entitled to damages under the New York Artist Authorship Rights Act, but did not consider the AFA's economic and utilitarian motives when considering fair use. Despite the freshness of the spotlight that was increasingly being shed on queer artists and activists, Wojnarowicz was certainly not the first queer public figure to have been targeted and censored because of the transgressive nature of his work. His lawsuit against the AFA followed similar controversies and culturally conservative attacks, often led by Wildman and North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms against artists like Robert Mapplethorpe and Andre Serrano, whose work similarly featured transgressive content that were funded by the NEA. However, these cases differ because Mapplethorpe and Serrano were better established as artists and more able to withstand attacks against their reputations. Some of Mapplethorpe's most well-known work displayed nudity and explicit images from the queer BDSM scene, and at times, more problematically, images that reinforce stereotypes about and fetishize Black masculinity, while Serrano was most notorious for his exceptionally edgy piece titled Piss Christ, in which he submerged a crucifix into a glass of his own urine. I think it's important to note that both of these artists were gay men and that Mapplethorpe ultimately died of AIDS as well. But still, long before these landmark controversies, in 1980, Ronald Reagan unsuccessfully attempted to abolish the NEA, and still, speeding ahead, as recently as 2020, former President Donald Trump unsuccessfully attempted to cease funding for the NEA through the 2021 budget proposal. In this timeline of attacks against the NEA and controversial art, the outcome of David Wojnarowicz versus the American Family Association was a foreseeable result of the battle conservative politicians and organizations were waging on art that dared to question or critique the dominant state of affairs. A compromise on the NEA's 1990 appropriations bill prohibited funding for projects that could be considered obscene. So by framing Wojnarowicz's art as obscene, the AFA could effectively censor him by challenging public funding for his work, even if Wojnarowicz presented a compelling argument against the AFA's claims of fair use. While exceptional ideological progress has followed from queer artists, and notably David Wojnarowicz, making the private into something public, queer art remains a site of intense contestation when it comes to public funding. Here, I've included an image of Wojnarowicz wearing his hand-painted jacket with the morbidly heroic and devastating statement you see here, which many of you may have been familiar with, if even not familiar with the artist himself. And I'll leave off here with a quote from Wojnarowicz's memoir titled Close to the Knives, a Memoir of Disintegration. Thank you.